And we are live recording. And I'll just say that one more time. At this point, if you still have your camera on, you understand that this is being recorded and is going to be placed on YouTube. And if you don't want your video to be on YouTube, scroll down and hit stop video. You'll also see in that bottom scroll bar there a little chat menu too. So maybe jump over there and say hey to the group. Hey, Jerry and Kim. It's been so long. Awesome. So nice to be seeing so many familiar people in here. So a little bit of an overview for the night tonight. So we've got this week's special guest with us, which just happens to be my wife, Laura Gilmore here. So I'm really excited about this one. We've had some, Laura was part of the winter series with us, and we got a lot of great feedback about that winter one. So that was a lot of fun. And our game plan for the night, the theme for tonight is kind of around wild plants and wild food, and foraging ethics and relationships with plants, as well as kind of modern day homesteading. So that's kind of where we're going to go. And as far as kind of our breakdown, we're going to do an opening in a moment here, and I'm going to pass it over to Laura to kind of start us off and just bring our minds and our hearts together in a good way, help us feel connected to nature while we sit in front of these calls together. And then from there, we're going to do a little bit of a what's happening out in nature session, so a little bit of nature awareness. And there'll be an opportunity to jump into a breakout room to share with the rest of the group for those of you that are attending with us live tonight. And then after that, we'll kind of dive into the main topic for tonight, and we'll hear some of Laura's thoughts on all of those topics. So that's our game plan for tonight. And the only other thing I'll mention is there's one more call left in the spring series. It's with a past student and good friend of mine named Carolyn Crawley is her name. And she has an organization, I'm probably going to pronounce this wrong, so I apologize if Carolyn happens to be watching, but I think she's Muskoka, I believe is the word. And Carolyn's got a fascinating background, a fascinating history, but her business and her teachings come from this interesting mixed ancestry. So she's Mi'kmaq, Irish, and African. And Miskomack, in my understanding, means all my relations in her native language. And that's going to be the theme of the call with her in 2 weeks from today, all my relations with Carolyn. So really looking forward to that night. So yeah, and that's in 2 weeks from today. So I think that's May 27th. And that'll be the last session for the spring round here. But with that all said, I'm going to pass it over to Laura to kind of bring us together right now. And then we'll do a little bit of an intro to her after that. So.
I just want to say a few words, do a little bit of a meditation just to, even though we're here on Zoom, and we're, especially if you're in Ontario, you're probably at home. And for some of us, our favorite places in nature aren't at home. So I just want to take a minute and I'll have everyone close their eyes. So just close your eyes and take a few deep breaths. And I want you to picture yourself sitting in one of your favorite places in nature. Just take a moment and picture where that is. And when you're looking around this favorite place in nature that you're in, what do you see? What season is it in this favorite spot? Maybe it's the northern woods during beautiful fall colors. Or a warm summer's day on Oceanside. What things stand out to you visually in this spot? What aspects of nature catch your eye? The trees, maybe it's flowing water, moss on rocks. What do you hear in this place? What are your favorite sounds in your spot? Maybe it's bird song in springtime. Maybe it's the gentle sound of waves crashing on the shore. Or the sound of a beautiful flowing river over rocks. Maybe you hear wolf howls or the sound of a crackling fire at your favorite campsite. Take a second, just sink into what the sounds are at your favorite spot. Taking a deep breath in through your nose, imagining you're in your favorite spot. What do you smell? Maybe it's the apple blossoms, moist earth. This smell of the sea. The roses in your own garden. How does your body feel in this place? Do you feel the warm sun, your skin exposed to the breeze as you lay on your favorite beach? Or maybe your favorite spot's wintertime. You can feel the cool breeze. You're all bundled up. You feel the snowflakes falling on your cheeks. Even just internally, how does your body feel in this place? Hopefully relaxed, but maybe invigorated from a run or the rush of catching your favorite wave. Is there anything to eat? What do you taste in your favorite place? Maybe there's wild blueberries or bitter dandelion greens. Maybe you're cooking a fresh trout on the fire in your favorite campsite. What flavors make your mouth water from your favorite spot? Hopefully you're all have big smiles on your faces while you think of this favorite spot that you're in. And I sincerely hope that all of you, and myself included, get to visit my favorite spot soon. You can open your eyes and we'll all come back together here in our homes.
Awesome. Sweet. Well, thanks, Laura. Yeah, I really like starting off our calls with just that. I know so many of us spend way too much time on the computer these days. And if we're going to spend a little bit of extra time in our evenings on the computers, it's just kind of nice to remind ourselves that we're still connected to all those, our senses and everything going on outside. So always nice to start our minds off that way. So actually, I'm going to hold off. Usually I introduce the speaker kind of right after we do that opening. But I think I'm going to wait until after our first segment tonight, because we're gonna, and it'll be kind of part of Laura's story when we get into the realm of harvesting wild plants and wild foods. So maybe we'll kind of just dig into our first segment tonight, which is a little bit of a snapshot on what's going on out in nature in our own backyards. And what I love about this is Laura and I are going to share a little bit about what we're noticing. We live up in this ancient mountain range that's sometimes referred to as the Granite Shield. So we're in kind of what's known today as central Ontario, near a giant park called Algonquin Park, for those of you that don't know the region there, a little town called Dwight. So that's the land that we're up on right now. And what's kind of neat, when we go up into the breakout rooms, you have the opportunity to hear from people from ecosystems all over the world. And I love just being able to track kind of what's going on in different parts of the globe and different parts of the planet, as it relates to the seasons and as it relates to what's going on out in nature. So with that said, I'll maybe just share a couple of things that have been on my radar, and then I'll pass it over to Laura to share a little bit about what she's been noticing. And then we're going to split into breakout rooms. And if you'd like the opportunity to share and hear from other folks what they're noticing in their neighborhood, then we'll shift to that. So, man, there's so many things we could talk about. I'd imagine that we're a little bit behind a lot of folks on this call, being that we're at a little bit of a more northern latitude. Spring is really just starting to arrive here in full force. Which is exciting. You know, the leaves are starting to open up right now. And one thing that I always get excited, I'm curious who on this call does this, but I love tracking the order in which different tree species start to bud out and leaf out. You know, where we live, and I chatted about this weeks ago, the very first one that starts to swell is the sugar maples here, and then the red maples. We see the buds starting to get bigger and they start to flower. And that's been going on for weeks already. They're starting to leaf out. But if you look at the oaks, like the oaks, their buds are just starting to swell right now. So even though some of our plants, like the maples, are actually starting to grow leaves, the oaks still just have buds. Same with the birches here. The white birches still just no leaf sign on them yet.
No, they're open.
The leaves?
Yeah. Just today I noticed on my drive to Dwight, there was no white birch open. Yellow birch, yes.
Yeah.
But the white birch were not open on my drive to Dwight.
Town?
And on my drive home from Dwight, they were open.
Okay. Yeah, so I noticed here the poplars, the birches, the oaks are some of the last ones to leaf out, whereas things like the basswoods and the maples have been out for a little while already. So that's one thing that's been on my radar. Another one is paying attention to what's shifting in the water right now, water ecology. A little bit south of here, and actually probably around here too, the rainbow trout have just finished their spring spawn run, which is pretty exciting. I know some people that were down fishing trout down south. And there's always this question of when's the water going to flip over, you know, and I think we're a little ways from that still. But once with this kind of warm stretch of weather coming in, there's going to be some serious shifts in water ecology that's happening right now. We're starting to see all the water plants growing up from underneath the water. So we'll see a lot of those coming on real soon. And then I've been noticing a lot with the birds. And I know Laura wanted to comment that as well. But one thing particularly, I've been following turkeys a lot lately and paying attention. And I think last call I was chatting about hearing turkeys gobble at sunrise every morning. And for the last week and a half, I haven't heard any gobbling in the morning. Which what that tells me is that the male toms have gone and they've now bred with a bunch of the hens. The hens have kind of split up now and they're looking for places, or they're probably a lot of the hens are actually nesting right now. And I've heard a few stories of nests happening with the turkeys. And now these toms who used to be kind of following along the flocks, they're actually traveling mass distances and they're not gobbling as much, but they're kind of looking for that odd hen that hasn't been bred yet, or the hen that maybe had a set of eggs or a clutch. And for whatever reason, maybe a coyote or a wolf got to them, or there was a failure and they're ready to actually try and breed for a second time. But the toms actually go really quiet this time of year and they cover tons and tons of distance, a lot more than they normally would, looking for those odd turkeys out there. So that's something going on here right now. I suspect the deer are probably, I haven't seen a deer. I'd be curious if anyone has lately, but I'd imagine they have the tiniest little antler stubs starting to pop out of their heads and starting to grow right now. Which is super exciting. And the grouse are starting to display. Laura and I actually saw one yesterday, and it was doing this beautiful dance where it kind of puffed its head up and its neck feathers up and its tail out, and was doing this really fun kind of mating dance in the forest. So watching the mating dances were super fun. And you folks that have been following along, you know, I've been talking about the warblers each week. When are the warblers going to return? When are the warblers? And just this past week, I've seen a ton finally. Saw a black and white warbler today, a chestnut-sided warbler, yellow rump warbler. A whole bunch of warblers are finally starting to return to the forest. So that's really exciting as well. So that's some of what I'm noticing. What's going on or what are you paying attention to and watching?
Yeah, I mean, on the note of the warblers, like you're mentioning, they're still traveling. I've really noticed like when they're just come and migrate, they are still traveling in the like mixed groups. So yesterday we saw a flock of warblers, and again, it can be confusing because you hear all these different songs from the same group of birds, and it was in the same like group moving together was yellow-rumped warbler, the black-throated green warbler, and what we're pretty sure was a palm warbler. So that was pretty neat. For me, the thing that I mean, right now the blossoms are, like all the fruit trees are just starting to really put their blossoms out. I know in the south, you know, you get the cherry blossoms, and like our apples are just about to burst, but the service berries are blossoming. The choke cherries are just budding. Our Canada plum is blooming right now. But what I really always feel at this time of year is the ground, like the ground layer of the forest is what comes alive the most. And when I think about spring, I always think about the fact that the forest comes alive from the ground up. So, you know, all of the herbaceous plants are not just growing, but like a number of them are even going to starting to bloom. And all of these forest floor plants are fully alive, like the trilliums and the trout lilies and all these species that even by the middle of summer are completely gone. But the whole forest floor is alive, and then the shrubs closest to the forest floor leaf out completely, and it's almost like it moves up. And those top canopy species, like when you're talking about some of those tree species that leaf out last, I always think of as the canopy species. They're the ones at the very top. And even from an individual, like you were saying the oaks will be the last, but a young oak that's a little sapling will leaf out before the one at the top. So I always think of this like it's this energy moving upward. And so everything, and I even thinking, just for me, I'm thinking about that, like wolf pups and fox kits, you know, they start underground, and then everyone's energy moves up as spring goes on. Yeah, so just that very upward energy of springtime is just really current for me.
Awesome. So we're going to have an opportunity for folks to jump in and do some sharing and do a little check-in. I suspect some of you in more southern regions are way further along, you know, than we are with all these pieces. So we'll get a little bit of a snapshot around the listening area tonight. So for this piece, if you don't want to participate, it's definitely optional. So you have an opportunity to pause your screen right now. And we're going to start the chat with Laura this evening. So yeah, I guess a great way to start this conversation, it's kind of funny talking to you folks with her right beside me. I usually see the guest's face in front of me, so it might be kind of funny if I'm trying to figure out where to put my eyes. So just a little bit of a warning there for everyone. I'm going to turn the screen just a bit too. But I think maybe as a great starting point would be for those of you that aren't familiar with Laura and her work and her background, I'll maybe just ask you to share a little bit about your roots in this realm of wild foraging, because Laura was introduced to this pretty young in life. This idea that there's more than just vegetables from our garden that's actually edible. And I know she had a couple stories from pretty young in life that were pretty kind of pivotal in her journey and her influence and the choices that she'd made in life. So I'll maybe just start off by just asking if you want to share a little bit about how you got into wild foraging and this idea of different ways to tend the land and different things to eat and things of that nature. So let's start there.
Yeah, I feel really blessed that I had a childhood that was close to nature, and I had people around me who were close to the land. So when I was quite young, so I live in the Muskoka region now. I moved here when I was 11. But when I was really young, we lived in a rural area on the Niagara Peninsula, just outside of the town called Welland. On my father's side, they were early settlers in that region. And so my grandparents' farm was a concession dirt road from the house that we lived in. The house that we lived in, my parents didn't own. It was owned by an Italian man named Bruno, and our neighbor was a woman named Mrs. Rinaldi. She's also Italian. So I was surrounded by these incredible Italian gardeners. And I'm the youngest of four. Which typically means you spend a lot of time being taken care of by your older siblings and neighbors and people. So I was lucky enough that I got to spend a lot of time when I was really young with Mrs. Rinaldi. And so Mrs. Rinaldi had this property. So her front lawn was, just lawn, and she had these lion statues, and her house was, I remember her living room was like all red velvet couches and red, and had like plastic sheeting. And I, as a 5-year-old, was not allowed to be upstairs, so she had this like pristine upstairs, and then her basement was the most incredible production kitchen I've ever seen. And her backyard, every square inch of her backyard was turned into food. And so she grew all these beautiful vegetables, and she had chickens, and she raised rabbits, things that I all do now. And the other thing is, we would go for walks, and she would pick things. And I remember her pointing out puffball, like just because I would see them, and she would ask me to go grab them. But I don't remember the other things that we picked, being a 4 and 5-year-old child, but I just remember we picked things. I was also really fortunate in that my grandparents had, a big farm, and so food came from the land, in that form, and they raised animals, and my mom, my stepfather, hunted and fished. So it wasn't unusual to see a deer hanging or to go fishing for hours and hours and hours on end. But food, to me, I was fortunate enough in that the idea of food coming from the land was what was normal. And so even though we moved up north and my direct connection to food kind of broke a little bit, that seed of connection was there. And so I studied post-secondary. In post-secondary, I studied ecology, and I was really inspired to learn about ecology and plants. Particularly, I was always excited about plants. I was definitely one of those kids that spent more time picking dandelions while playing in the outfield during baseball than playing baseball. So plants always attracted me. The quietness of the way that plants is very much in tune with my personality, being an introvert. So I studied ecology, but I realized studying in academia that I was learning about plants as these secondary objects, whereas I really wanted to learn how to work with plants and be in relationship with plants. So I actually left after I graduated. I went and spent about 4 years just finding anyone that I could, a lot of time on the West Coast. So just like backwood homesteaders and herbalists, and went to all these permaculture farms. And I was actually thinking today about, they made the announcement that the Greyhound bus is canceled in Canada. And I thought, I was reflecting a lot about the accessibility that as a young person without much money, the Greyhound was such an important tool for my discovery. I was thinking like, wow, I spent so much time. I used to be able to get this across Canada for $129 bus ticket. And that Greyhound bus used to take me to all of these different remote places where I got to spend time with herbalists and work in gardens. And that was the big thing for me, is I've always been someone who sought out experiences more than just book knowledge. So I think the roots are, I was someone who was fortunate enough as a child to just be immersed in a culture of food from the land. And then as an adult, I picked up that spark and have just sought out as many different teachers as I can. And most importantly, just spending lots of time on the land. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's kind of, I can relate to Laura's story so much. So I think some of you folks that have been around these calls for a bit can remember that I have a background, like an academic background in the outdoors as well. I went to school and studied outdoor education as well as forestry. And it actually took a bit of time to like deprogram my brain afterwards. In forestry, I learned a lot of names. We learned to measure trees and to kind of quantify data around forests. And my brain actually started programming kind of around that. And after I left forestry, like Laura, we started traveling to these farms and meeting different mentors. And realized that, there's so much that was missing in what a forest actually is if you're just focused on naming things and measuring things. And that gets into those intricate things like Laura was just sharing about, like, the way that the forests kind of leaf out from the floor and work their way up. And why do some species leaf earlier than others? There's all these beautiful mystical relationships that happen that weren't necessarily being taught in the way that I was taught about kind of quantifying the forest. And that's one of the things I've always really appreciated about Laura's kind of approach to being a wild forager. Is it's very relational based. It's not just about, well, what plant do I want to harvest? It's very much about like fostering this relationship and this kind of like harmonic dance with the land. So maybe to go there first, like, what about relation, or actually, no, let's start with stewardship, because that's a good place to start with. I know there's a growing interest in foraging right now. There's a lot of people that are interested, in just this idea that we can go out and get food, and whether it's people want to do that because they want to deepen their connection to the land, or whether people want to be more self-reliant. There's many reasons why people get into foraging, but of course, one of the concerns is the more people you have foraging and taking from the land, the bigger the impact theoretically could be from it. So if we're introducing more people into foraging, how do we mitigate against the potential negative impacts? What do ethics look like as a wild forager, and how do we make sure that we're in right relation with the things that we're harvesting, the animals that need to come harvest them, and the other people that maybe want to harvest from them as well? So we're not just thinking about ourselves and our own needs when we're foraging. So what about starting there?
Yeah. I think it's part of that. I mean, it is relational based. It's I think it's getting to know each species that you want to harvest individually, as opposed to a resource that we're going out into the forest to harvest. And I'm a participant on a number of kind of Facebook foraging groups, which can be really great for beginners, but can also be problematic in other ways. But what I find, even when we talk about foraging, there tends to be a focus on a really limited number of species. And so that there's a real intense focus on a small number of species, where when I think about foraging really and how it's integrated into my life, now I have my business, which is a foraging based business, and then there's how I approach foraging as an individual. And foraging is just, to me as an individual, eating a variety of plants from the land and being in relationship with a number of different plants, and in that maybe wouldn't be applicable for my business. So from the ethics standpoint, first and foremost is we need to learn about the species that we want to harvest, and be in relationship with them before we're ever picking them. So for myself, especially species that I had never picked before, my journey to actually learn to be a forager has taken a long time, because for some species, I have followed them through their entire growing life cycle. So spending more than a year getting to know a species before I would go to pick it. Because that was, especially when I was not introduced to it by a mentor, that was always really important to me. So I remember at different times in my life, like literally marking, popsicle sticks and putting them in the ground, and watching those plants grow and making sure I had my ID properly, and then paying attention to where that plant goes, making sure that you're never harvesting, from an area where it's in a limited abundance, like learning about not just the plant and it's how to identify it, but how does it grow? What kind of habitat does it like? What other, is it abundant just in this individual place, or is it abundant across the regions? Wild leeks is an example I can talk a bit about from an ethics perspective, because there's a lot of conversation about how do you harvest wild leeks ethically. And it can really vary from region to region, person to person in some ways. And here's how I think. So I live in a region, so wild leeks are a very, very popular wild plant. A lot of people want to pick them. Again, they're focal species on a lot of the foraging boards I'm seeing right now. And it is one that I harvest commercially for my business. So I harvest a lot. I harvested 60 pounds of wild leek this year. 65. So the plant wild leeks or ramps, it's in the allium family. So the onion garlic family. It is a plant that grows in hardwoods forests, and it's native to the entire eastern seaboard, the whole original Carolinian forest. This is where I live here. It's about its northern range. It would go all the way south into the southern states. In most of the areas that it's native to, it is either uncommon, in some places it's endangered. So across its range, it is seen quite a bit of loss due to overharvesting. But in Muskoka, in the actual region where we live in Ontario, it is actually considered a common plant. It's not threatened, it's not endangered. There's no legal protections that protect it. Particularly in Muskoka, we have probably hundreds of acres of intact habitat because we're lucky enough to have abundant forests for it. And so I know a lot of people argue, oh, in Ontario, you don't have to harvest it sustainably because it's not a threatened species here. But I look at the bigger picture of the fact that in most of the places that it grows, it's not abundant. And so even though it's locally abundant, I want to be as thoughtful as possible. So I only pick leaves. So even though the places that I go are acres and acres of almost solid leek, I still will just go slowly through patches. And anytime I approach a new patch of leeks, I will walk around for a while first and just get a feel for the land, get a feel for the patch. Where does it feel really healthy? And I just go with a pair of scissors and I pick really carefully. And I make sure I'm not disturbing I like I don't dig bulbs, even though there are some people who can, say why harvesting a certain amount of bulbs is, sustainable or not. I don't like disturbing the soil. I like to leave things as intact as possible. The other species of plants that are growing up, like the trilliums and the trout lilies, I try to leave them as just undisturbed as possible. And I just trim the leeks. And I can just harvest the leaves, and then when I find like a stem with the seeds from previous years, I'll collect those seeds and I take a few minutes and I will walk into a part of the property that doesn't have leeks, and I'll pull back the leaves and plant the seeds in the soil. And I just move really slow and I pay close attention to what's going on. And I pay attention to leeks. I remember one year there was a really late frost and the leeks had been kind of like frost tipped in certain areas. And so I was really careful, like in those areas where they seemed to be struggling, I didn't pick, I think of myself. When I don't have personal resources, when I'm feeling kind of stressed or not at my best, I can't give a lot. So I always think about the plants have the same thing. And so those are kind of that's my mindset approaching that one plant. And so when people ask about ethics of just take 5% of a patch or 10% of a patch or these quantifiable numbers, it's not, to me, it's hard to say that there is a numerical way to approach ethical foraging. I look at it as, what's the relationship that you have with that species? So for me, it's, have I learned about this plant and how it likes to grow and what else is in relationship with it? Is there a way that I can tend? So something that I can give back. When I harvest, when people say how much to take, I say, when I leave an area from foraging, it should pretty much look like I wasn't there. And so if you are digging leek bulbs, that means making sure that you're putting the soil back and replanting the small ones and putting the leaves back and or any other plant that I'm harvesting. I want to make sure my impact is not noticeable, and that I find some way to kind of give back. So the ethics are not a quantifiable, it'll only take 5% of a population. It's making sure that you're being in right relationship to the species, to the land in general. Asking for permission of not just the plants, but also making sure you're on property that you should be on. And yeah, so just again, I think of it so much like my human relationships. So ethics to me and in relation to foraging is really just, yeah, it comes back to that topic of building good relationships with my plant friends. Mm-hmm.
Awesome.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'll maybe just highlight. I took a couple notes as Laura was talking there, so I might just summarize and highlight a couple of things that kind of jumped out for me there. So one of the things, she was talking about is just like how important it is to know like who else is actually using these plants, right? Are there wildlife feeding here? Are there other people feeding on these plants? Or am I the only one that's going to be coming and harvesting this? That's super important. Like if you don't know what local wildlife eat the plant, then maybe you want to learn about that before you actually start harvesting it, She also chatted about, are there ways to kind of propagate as you go? And that, one of the goals is to go in and harvest in a way that if someone came in after her, they wouldn't actually know that she was there, and how you can maybe collect the seeds of the plant and spread the leaves. And some of the patches that we've been harvesting leeks from for years now are actually larger after harvesting them for a number of years than they were when we first started harvesting them. So I'm a big proponent that humans can actually have this really healthy symbiotic relationship with wild foods on the land, and potentially more people could be harvesting wild foods than are now. But we got to get out of this Western mindset that it's like, oh, I want to learn to forage. What can I eat now? And that's, I think, maybe what Laura was kind of poking at with the Facebook groups, where it can sometimes be problematic. Is you'll see these pictures of someone just takes a picture and is like, hey, can I eat this? And if someone says yes, then great, they're going to go and harvest it. But do you really know the impact of just going and harvesting this thing that you just learned how to eat? Or have you been watching it throughout the year? Do you know how abundant it is in the area? Do you know, is that patch healthy? And you won't necessarily know if that individual patch or plant is healthy if you haven't actually observed it for a while to know what health looks like, right? Mm-hmm. So what does health look like for that plant? Or what does being stressed look like for that plant? Are there indicators that are going to tell you one way? And if you don't know the answer to that, then maybe that's something you want to actually dig into a little bit before you start harvesting it. So I think maybe shifting the timeline a little bit, that foraging is this lifelong journey, and it's not necessarily about what I can eat right now. And I know Laura's a big proponent of like watching these plants throughout the year. Actually, there's a good example that comes up to me thinking about safety, because Laura, we were looking at 2 plants the other day when we were in Algonquin Park. And I know there's a lot of questions about safety with wild plants too, because there's toxic plants and there's straight up poisonous plants out there. And 2 that we were looking at was Helleborn and Solomon seal, growing right next to each other. And in the spring, the shoots look very similar to each other. But because Laura watches them, sometimes when you're harvesting a plant, it's not actually showing the flower parts or some of the easier ID features. So maybe you just want to chat a little bit about like how watching the plants throughout the year can also increase our safety when we're foraging, and help us with our identification in some of those fringe seasons.
Yeah, I mean, that perfect example, right? In the spring, we have all these wonderful foods. Like we all know asparagus is a vegetable that you can get in the grocery store, and there are wild asparagus plants in Ontario. But there are also a number of other species, particularly right now in these forests where I live. There are at least a half dozen plants that I eat the shoots of. And so when you're eating the shoots of a plant, that's like eating the asparagus shoot. And so if any of you grow asparagus, like we all know what the asparagus in the grocery store looks like. How many people here actually have seen an asparagus plant when it's in full growth? And so you're not raising, I can't see raised hands, but it looks really, really different. And so there was a question on the forums recently, people being like, how do I find an asparagus patch? And I'm like, well, for me, as someone who's integrated foraging so much of my life, I'm like, well, by the time spring comes around, I already know where my patches of my Solomon seal are, or the fiddleheads, or all of the other, blue bead lily and different shoots that I eat, because I am watching those I found those plants and I've been watching them. I watched them all last summer. So I was talking, like when Chris and I were looking at the shoots yesterday, the hellebore and the false Solomon seal right next to each other. Whereas if I were to just describe botanically how to tell one from the other at the stage that you'd harvested, it would be really difficult. But I was like, on our property, that plant doesn't grow like this. And so when I'm harvesting the Solomon seal shoots, I'm not just harvesting the shoot because I've identified it. I also know that hillside where they grow, and I know that the poisonous plants that would be the lookalikes don't grow in that individual spot. So it's, yeah, that layer of relationship is not just the individual plants, but like it's that particular place.
Yeah, and I know Laura used that a lot with mushrooms too, because there's a lot, probably way more so than the plant realm. There's a lot of toxic and poisonous mushrooms out there, and a lot of them that look very similar. And often one of the things that you're looking at, you're not just looking at the idea of the mushroom itself, you're actually looking at what habitat is it growing in? What are the relationships between that mushroom and the trees and the plant communities? So you actually want to have an idea of the ecology and the relationships that plant holds with other species, because generally you find similar plants growing in similar areas. It's habitats, just like you find similar trees growing in different habitats. You find similar mammals in particular habitats, right? And sometimes part of your ID is actually knowing the ecology of an actual habitat, and to know it. So there's just kind of another thought on that one. Just thinking about for folks that are maybe totally beginner to the world of plants, I just wanted to mention two things. One of them, just in case you missed it there. So one of the easier ways, or I shouldn't say easy because it can actually be challenging sometimes too, but one of the most sure ways to identify a plant is often by the flower and looking at the parts of the flower, like counting the number of petals and the sepals and different things like that. And that's why Laura was saying, if a plant's not flowering, you're often missing one of the most sure ways to ID it there, which is why it's really helpful if you actually were to ID the plant during the flowering season and then come back to it, because maybe you don't actually harvest it while it's flowering. You harvest it earlier than that. But once you've ID'd it flowering, then you can actually come back there later on. And the other one, I wanted to jump back to the leek conversation for folks that are totally new to ramps or wild leeks, and that the wild leek has this beautiful oniony flavor to it. And some people dig up the entire plant. So there's a bulb that grows incredibly slow, and they can grow really old. They actually propagate pretty slowly, leeks. And if you take out the whole bulb from the ground, well, then it doesn't come back next year. So what Laura was talking about is, well, you actually get almost just as much flavor just in the leaf itself. So instead of digging the bulb out of the ground, you can actually just cut one of the leaves off. And now that plant's still going to come back next year. It's still going to produce seeds. And not to say that it's wrong, like to harvest bulbs. There are ways you can sustainably harvest bulbs in places, but you may need to want to ask some of those other questions. Who else is harvesting here? How are they doing regionally? How is this patch doing? Questions to kind of that nature around it. So
for myself with that, because I used to harvest bulbs, because that was how I learned, was from people who dug bulbs. And one year I had dug a bunch of bulbs, and I because that's what I'd always done. And I actually calculated, I sat there because it was like each plant that was mature enough to produce a flower. So I could tell which plants were going to produce a flower were at least 7 years old. And then I was kind of guessing then the big bulbs that were probably 20 plus years old. I remember I was holding a bunch of leeks in my hand, the bulbs, and I had roughly calculated that it was 150 years of growth. Wow. In the hand of, like, of all the years for this little pile of leeks bulbs. And I felt really like guilty. My thought was, this is unnecessary. Like, I don't have to, it wasn't necessary for me to dig these. And so that's kind of why I don't dig bulbs now. Not because I don't, from a sustainability perspective, I just felt like it wasn't necessary. Like, I can just leave them in the ground and just harvest the leaves.
Right. 150 years of growth for one meal.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I just was like, that doesn't feel, I didn't feel like I needed to do that.
So there'd be another question. If you're going out to harvest something, like how many years did it take to grow what you're going to now harvest for one meal? That's a really great thing to know from a stewardship and ethics perspective. And
really important then to, again, the ethics part is then how are you using this? So I think that's why I was like, to just make soup, this felt unnecessary. But I have definitely dug medicine roots before that I knew had aged, that I aged out, that were quite old, and I thought, okay, well, I'm so thankful that the forest took a decade to grow this medicine that my body really needs or someone really needs. And so then I make sure that I use every part of it really well. Because that's also part of the ethics, is making sure that you don't waste. And when I first got excited about foraging, I used to like harvest so much, and I just got excited about the abundance, and so would like pick all these things and make all these things. And I've learned the value now of how much time. So the harvesting is the easy part. The post-processing takes so much time. Sometimes I say it takes 2 to 3 times the amount of time to process something properly as it does to pick it. And so making sure that part of the ethics is making sure that you process it properly, make proper use of all of it, don't waste any of it. Because some of these wild plants take the earth a long time. But there's also, we'll get into, but there's lots of places, if you're feeling like overwhelmed by that, there's lots of things that are freely given and that are helpful for us to pick abundance of.
Yeah, well, let's go there next. Let's chat about, for folks that want to get into foraging or maybe are new to foraging, where's a good kind of starting point for that? And I'll share one before you go, but a great book. I just went and grabbed it a second ago. This one here, it's called Botany in a Day by Thomas J. Elpel. Botany in a Day. And if this one isn't in your library, I highly, highly recommend it. Absolutely fabulous book. I'll say that one more time. Botany in a Day, The Pattern Method of Plant Identification. It's one of the most brilliant pieces of work in actually understanding the plant families and the relationships of plants over time. So it really just helps you kind of go from that wall of green to like, what are some of the key identification features? And this one's not necessarily focused on edibles, but just brilliant the way it's laid out around IDing and understanding plant relationships, plant families, and things of that nature. So I'm a big fan of this one as a starting point in your plant and your foraging journey. But what would be some of your top tips for folks wanting to start with foraging, how to get going? And making sure that you're doing it safely, making sure you're doing it ethically. Like you said, there's some plants you can actually harvest in abundance and feel good about harvesting in abundance, right? If you know their life cycle.
Yeah. So, I mean, I definitely share this in all of my walks, and I mean, lots of other herbalists and foragers do, but to start with your weeds, like start literally with the things that grow around you. If you're lucky enough to have a yard where you live, I know it's pretty hard if you live in an apartment building, but if you're fortunate to have any little patch of dirt around you, you're gonna have probably in almost any little patch of dirt, like a half dozen at least, good edible species. So plantain and dandelion and garlic mustard and the, Japanese knotweed shoots and, lamb's quarters and the tree leaves. Oh my gosh, the basswood leaves and the beech leaves and the conifer tips and things that are so abundant. Lilac flowers, and I guess there's certain things that you maybe are like borderline wild, but where we live, there's actually lots of wild lilacs. There's just so many things that are abundant, that are really easy to identify, and that are common enough that you can get to know them pretty quickly. Most of us know what a dandelion looks like. So certain, when I say that you've been watching plants over time, many of us are unconscious that we actually know a lot of plants. So you don't necessarily, unlike the false Solomon seal shoots that I was talking about wanting to harvest, that's something that, if you were new to foraging, I would say you need to develop a relationship with that plant for a few years before you can safely harvest. But something like plantain is super easy to identify, and there's not really any like poisonous lookalikes too much once you know the features. It's something that like you can kind of fast forward on being able to harvest. Pine trees or spruce tips are like, you can kind of learn those pretty quick. Where then there are other plants that take longer. So it's those things that I was gonna say, it's the on those Facebook foraging forums, it's the ones that people don't talk about. It's like the most common things, but you can do so much with those plants. Like people that want to harvest wild leeks, but they don't have access to the acres that I'm talking about, I have access to here. Again, I recognize I'm super privileged with that, but if you're in Southern Ontario, you probably have access to garlic mustard or wild chives that escape from people's gardens. And yeah, and so they're really, those can be your substitutes, because you don't have access to those leeks and they're not, abundant in that population. You don't have asparagus, you can try Japanese knotweed shoots, and so those are the things that are the closest to us, physically the closest to us, are the places to start. And so for me, I'm in more of a wild place. Like I literally don't have garlic mustard, thankfully, because it's really invasive. But yeah, so start with what's close to you. And from the safety perspective, again, we do want to be conscious of the soils that the plants grow in. So if they are kind of contaminated soils, we should be not harvesting the plants that grow in those places. So in kind of urban, suburban areas, I typically will say, look for the places where people have gardens and the weedy little edges around gardens. So if people are gardening in those areas, they're probably safe. I spent a lot of time learning about wild foods while I was volunteering on organic farms. And I would be pulling all these weeds, and then I would learn about those. So if you don't have even your own gardens, find a community garden or people who garden, or maybe there's like a local farm that you can get out to, and offer to help weed to go and learn plants and get a harvest. Those are literally good places to start. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, when we had, for those of you that were with us 2 weeks ago, when we had Stephen Martin, Sacred Gardener, on here, I'd asked him a similar question about getting started with this really interesting approach he had to tending the land. And he had given out this piece of advice, like, don't pull any weeds from your garden until you know what it is and you have a relationship with it. And that these weeds that we commonly pull are sometimes the healthiest food growing in our whole garden. Like they're healthier than the spinach and the broccoli that we're growing there, and then there's actually data on that, about how healthy some of these weeds are. I saw a couple cool questions coming in. One from our good friend Deb there, talking about preserving plants. So she mentioned she has garlic mustard and she already knows about eating it fresh. But what's a simple way that you could preserve the flavors of garlic mustard and use it throughout the year, or other things you can do with garlic mustard? Yeah. You got any on that for Deborah?
Yeah. So what I've done with garlic mustard before, you can like puree it with oil, and then like you can make a pesto with added other things, but I actually just do a lot of like herb purees. So it's just the herb, and then often stays even with garlic mustard, it'll be like, you could do just garlic mustard, but like I'll add a bunch of other things that I also have weeded out. But say you could just take the garlic mustard, puree it in oil, and then what I typically will do is freeze things like that into like an ice cube tray, so that and even just like half full ice cube tray. So what you end up with is these little small cubes of just the herb and oil, and you can freeze them and then just pull them out and add them to like pretty much almost anything where you're like, I want a garlicky, mustardy flavor to these eggs, or to this frittata, or to this pasta sauce, or to this really whatever. Like Chris knows I basically have almost like, and then I will also pull it out and I have like this herb paste in the fridge thawed, and then that's what I just use this like green paste all the time. Garlic mustard, you can also harvest it and then infuse it into apple cider vinegar. So just chop it up, cover it in apple cider vinegar, let it sit, and then about a month, 2 weeks to a month, just strain out the actual vegetable matter, and then you have basically an infused vinegar that then you can use for salad dressings and marinades. It's really like super pungent and fiery. It's really good. And then I've dried garlic mustard, but I don't love the just dried, other than if you do harvest it later in the year, you could harvest the seeds and basically, if you're committed enough, make your own mustard. We actually don't have, I don't get to, I only ever really work with garlic mustard. There's one patch near me that I typically will go. It's on a property where I actually do some like a little bit of foraging. It's like a private property. Someone lets me come and I try to go and pull all the garlic mustard because there's only a small area of it. So I pull all of it in the spring. So I typically don't let it go to seed in the places that I have it, but I know in some areas of Ontario, there's no stopping it. But yeah, so I know some people, I have tried garlic mustard kind of mustard seeds, like they had ground the mustard seeds and it was tasty.
Cool. Yeah. So oil and vinegar are two great preservatives for different foods. And we do that. Another one of our favorite is stinging nettle. And same thing, we'll puree up stinging nettle and mix it with oil, and then we'll just freeze it in the ice cube trays. And then like you're having a pasta, you literally just take out a cube of the nettle and you throw it in with your pasta. You know, you're making eggs, you throw it in there.
Yeah, even nettles you can just blanch and freeze too, just like any other vegetable.
Yeah, but it's such a great one. And it really adds, like, you should look into the nutritional value of some of these plants. Those two particularly, garlic mustard and nettle, are incredibly nutrient dense. And it's amazing. Like we're eating them all winter long in frozen ice cubes. So hopefully that helps with some idea there, Deb.
Someone asked if I dehydrate wild leek leaves. I do. Yeah, so I do wild leek vinegar and I also dehydrate the wild leek leaves. Now, when I dehydrate things, I try to leave things in as whole form as possible. So I use a proper, like a dehydrator, but I will harvest I'll put the whole leaf in. And then when I'm done, I put those leaves, I mean, for home use, I'd say like mason jars. At my commercial kitchen, I'm putting them in like food grade buckets, but I leave them in as whole of form as possible until I want to use them. And so then when I'm going to use something, so if I were to say dehydrate leaves for home, you could just dehydrate them, stuff them into mason jars, not breaking them. I mean, you'll break them a little bit because they're pretty fragile when they're dry. But then when I go to use them, I've powdered it like in a coffee grinder and made this vibrant green leek flavored powder. And like, man, you want to talk about like uber gourmet cooking, like to make a beautiful dish and then sprinkle like wild leaf powder. It's pretty amazing. I actually think the leaves are far more versatile than the bulbs are. You can do a lot with them.
Awesome. Yeah, Joan was saying there. Yeah, we do puree them raw when we're putting them into the oils. So we're working with the raw plant material there. I'm going to scroll up. There's a couple other questions in here. Wendy asks, could you puree it and mix with cider? Would it increase the potency of the flavor? So my thought is that it does a little bit. What's your thoughts on that?
It definitely, I don't know if it increases the potency, but it definitely it preserves it. And the thing that actually, raw wild leek can actually upset some people's stomachs because it's really strong. And the nice thing about any vinegar, this is why vinegar is really important on your salads, is vinegar will start, the acid will start to break down the greens and make them more digestible and bioavailable. So that's why I'm a big proponent of like just drizzling apple cider like vinegar on anything, and that's why I use them so much. But yeah, so it preserves, it also makes the vitamins and minerals more absorbable. I don't know if I would say it strengthens the flavor. They're pretty strong on their own. If anything, it makes the flavor a little less sharp because the fresh leeks are so sharp. Like amazing, but yeah, like I can eat them raw. Like I can sit out in the forest and like eat raw leeks, but Chris can't do it. Too hard on his stomach.
Do you know anything? Someone's asking about creeping Charlie. Do you know anything about that plant?
I do know the plant. I mean, it's in the mint family. So it's anything in that mint family you can pretty much harvest. They all have those like aromatic qualities. It's just like whether the flavor is good. And I've nibbled on the creeping Charlie before. If we're talking about the same plant, it kind of grows through lawns and then gets these like little purple flowers opposite. I just didn't love the flavor. Like you could eat it and I would maybe sprinkle it. Like if I had creeping Charlie through my property, I'd maybe toss a little bit in salads, but it's not something that I would harvest a lot of.
Cool.
Mhm.
I got two other ones. I don't know if you know about this one here, but somebody asked about, and I don't actually personally know this plant, field pussy toes. Do you know what they were referring to?
Yeah. Yeah. That's a beautiful plant. I learned about it as a traditional Anishinaabe medicine for menstrual cramps. And I've actually had it in tea for cramps before. So yeah, not as a food, but it was introduced to me as a medicine, particularly in Anishinaabe medicine.
Cool. Do you have any resources, recommendations on how to use what to make with wild edibles? So it's question one, number one, and then anything that includes interactions with medications and interactions in the body. Any top resources for those two questions?
For specifics to, I mean, there's so many books. Like if you're looking for books that for the food, I really like Samuel Thayer's books. Chris can pull a few. What I really like about his books is he gets into a lot of details about how to actually prepare things in detail. And I've met him before. And he like eats a lot of wild foods. And so his writing is written like from decades of experience, and like I've never seen anyone get so nuts and bolts about the preparation. So those are the ones I recommend for food. As for the, I don't have a specific resource in relation to herb and drug interactions. I'm not a clinical herbalist. So I do very much folk medicine, home folk medicine. I'll treat, basic colds and, my own personal health stuff. And I've learned a lot about medicines from kind of a folk tradition, but I don't, whenever, someone asks me herbal advice, and if they have, like I've learned about which herbs are a little safer and which ones are more complicated, but I don't actually have like one resource that I feel I'm competent with for herb and drug interactions. If there's any clinical herbalists or clinical herbal students on the call tonight, and you have maybe in your repertoire something that like a resource that you use, feel free to put that in the chats. But yeah, when it comes to herbal medicine, particularly herb drug interactions, I don't know. The one person off the top of my head that I have seen some stuff, Aviva Ram, she's pretty women specific. But she's really, I have gone to her before, particularly when I'm thinking about herbs potentially for women's stuff, or particularly because she's quite conscious around which herbs are safer for women in pregnancy and nursing. So I have gone to her, but I wouldn't say I have a ton of information on that.
Cool.
But yeah, if anyone does, because I know there's some clinical herbalists maybe sleep in this group.
We're getting close to our end here. So I want to shift gears in a moment here because I have one more topic I want to dive into a little bit with Laura, and then I want to leave a little bit of time at the end. But one more here. Carol had just asked about, I'm told not to eat too much wood sorrel. What do you think of that? And I believe that's due to the oxalic acid in there, right? And that is something to be wary of. But maybe you want to expand on that a little bit. So,
and that what I find one good way that I have learned is to so the wood sorrel, that's the oxalic acid, so that can, particularly for people with rheumatoid arthritis. So green herbs that have a sour taste. So not just the wood sorrel, but you would want to be careful with the Japanese knotweed as well, and potentially even the sumac. But yeah, I would be careful with the sour tasting greens because they're all going to have that same property.
That's kind of a neat thing. I mean, that's getting a little bit more advanced into the realm of herbal and medicine, but it's really neat if you go down this journey that there's actually different flavors associated with different kind of medicinal compounds or just chemical compounds inside of plants. And it's really neat, when you can get to the point where you can taste a plant that you maybe don't know and actually have a guess at maybe its medicinal properties or some of the chemical constituents based on the flavor of it. So there's just a neat little seed to plant for somebody that weren't aware of that. And Laura just mentioned there, those
Mhm.
sour plants you might want to be weary of, because that may be an indicator of oxalic acid in it. So yeah, let's do a little piece, maybe just a couple of minutes here on homesteading. Because that was one of the things I mentioned we talk about tonight. As some of you know, and maybe some of you don't, Laura and I live on a little 26-acre property. We have maybe a quarter acre under a kind of more modern kind of cultivation, you could say, although we have a very different and wild approach to even our modern cultivation. We're not like the straight rows and all clean cut kind of gardens. But let's chat a little bit about the intersection between wild crafting and actually growing food and kind of modern homesteading. So maybe you want to share a little bit about how we kind of integrate wild plants into our gardens and the way that we tend the land and try to do it in a somewhat sustainable and a relational way with the habitat that we live in.
Yeah. So one thing on the homestead, I'm the way I run things, nothing is wasted here. Even any of the plants that get weeded from the garden, if they're not, if the weeds like the purslane and the lamb's quarters and the field cress, those all end up in our salads. And if they didn't end up in our salad, they go to the rabbits or they go to the chickens. And then particularly when I'm weeding, and even if things that the chickens don't fully eat, everything's going from, so then the weeds that came from the garden that I'm not eating, the rabbits and the chickens are eating and then turning into fertilizer for us. And so everything keeps cycling back into the ground. But where we are, there's a number of wild foods that I really love to work with that we don't have growing in our region. So nettles, stinging nettles, to me is such an important plant that I wanted to be able to work with. And so I wanted to grow it. And so there's a property in Southern Ontario where we got dug out some original nettle plants from a path. And we brought them north. Now you want to be really conscious that when you do move plants like that, you're doing it safely, but also that you're conscious of other invasive species that might come with it. I've made that mistake before, like not being super careful and bringing not just the plant I wanted, but something else. But we brought nettles and we tried to plant them in like 3 different locations. And I think about if I were to put nettles in like a human personality onto nettles, anthropomorphized nettles, I would call them rebellious teenagers, because they did not grow in any of the spots that I wanted. I tried planting them in this beautiful wetland area, and then I cultivated this gorgeous bed for them and was watering them, and they would have nothing. And then I did do a big nettle harvest at one point, and I had all the seed, and I didn't tell Chris, but I just was frustrated after 4 years of trying to grow nettles. And I just went and I scattered nettle seed like all over the property in all these different spots, because I was like, nettles stop growing here. And then they took in 2 spots. They grew there. There's a big patch now next to our compost. There's just this feral spot, blackberries, and it's super gnarly. It's just like, it's basically like in our garden, it would be the basement of the garden. And when I think of that gnarly teenager just like hiding in the basement, yeah, this is the nettles totally took up next to this gnarly spot with the blackberries and the compost. And then a random super hard packed just sand random spot next to our greenhouse. So now I let them go and I'm really happy to have a patch, but it was like this interesting dance of trying to cultivate a wild plant and then the plant being like, no, you can't cultivate me. So I've had to have this dance of introducing certain plants that were wild, but then trying to like half cultivate them. So that's a fun one. And now I'm getting quite a bit of, other people saying try to transplant nettle and have it failed. yeah. So, and someone asked, where can I find sweetgrass? Richter's Herbs. You can buy sweetgrass. I also planted sweetgrass. It's grass. It will take over. Just be careful. It's great, but just be careful. It will grow quite vigorously. So we have introduced a number of really important edible species that now we've let go feral. And that was something in a number of the permaculture farms that Chris and I spent time on. There was this idea of, over time, as you grew your garden, you got what they called perennial annuals. And so plants that you purposely let self-seed. And then when they self-seed every year, you let them sprout and seed. And then what I just do is I carefully move things. So things like mullein and calendula and borage and like even like nice lamb's quarters and things, I will, like a certain ones that and evening primrose is another one that I let, it's a biennial and you can get the root and you can get the leaves and the flowers. So I have built up in our gardens, I've purposely introduced and then let certain plants self-seed so that we have like a weed base of these really useful plants. And then when they come up, I don't just let them sometimes, it depends. Sometimes I let things go in the carrot bed, but it's gotta be really special. Most of the time, as I will let the weeds flush and I'll see what's coming up. And then I carefully will dig things up and then move them to like the edges of the beds, or I'll like let a really nice plantain patch like go in the path, And so, yeah, this idea of I'm now called the weeds are half of the reason that I garden. I've invested my time into cultivating good weeds, not just, growing tomatoes.
Awesome. Yeah, something that I share too, if you think about like kind of some of our traditional vegetables that we grow, they're a lot of work,
Mm-hmm.
And one that we've battled with for years is spinach. You start off, you have to go and buy potting soil, and then you put them under lights and you start them. And if you don't start them early enough, they tend to bolt in the heat.
In the greenhouse, and the chipmunks get into them.
Yeah, and then they get eaten. Like they're a lot of work to try where we are. It's really tough to grow spinach. And we've been trying for years and years and years. But interesting enough, over the last few years, we've basically had these nettle patches establish themselves, which are very much like spinach and can be used like spinach, as well as this perennial plant called Good King Henry that comes up every year. And it's a perennial spinach that comes up every year. The chipmunks don't seem to eat it.
It's early.
It doesn't bolt, but it comes out early in the season. And we've kind of hit this point of like, why are we using so many resources trying to grow spinach every year when we can actually just work with these native plants and these perennial plants that are almost zero work? And by doing that, we're also reducing our impact on the land, and we're freeing up more of our own time by actually just working with what naturally kind of wants to grow or grows efficiently. So it's a different space for gardening to get into, but I think it's an important one to start to kind of think about. I know there's a lot of questions coming in. Here, let's just answer that one really quick. What was the first plant you mentioned? Do you remember that? I don't even remember at the very front. I think we started talking about wild leeks, Judy, although I'm not 100% certain.
Either that or it was Solomon seal.
Oh, wild leeks or Solomon seal might have been the first plants we were talking about tonight. I'd like to just chat about a couple more things quickly here. I've got one more question. Oh, no, just now. What was the first plant you mentioned? Oh, geez. It would have been either the nettle or the Good King Henry. Is that the one you're looking for, Good King Henry? Oh, geez. I don't know if I remember. If anyone else remembers. Sorry, I don't remember, Judy, which one it was that came before that one. So anyways, before we wrap up here tonight, I just want to share a couple of things, and then I want to pass it over to Laura here to kind of close us out for the evening. But I did want to mention a couple opportunities coming up that some folks might be interested in. One of them is a free one. Some of you may remember Caleb Musgrave, who was on here. He was one of the winter sessions here. Caleb runs the Canadian Bushcraft podcast and a really fascinating organization, Canadian Bushcraft. was brought up on the land, an absolute wealth of knowledge. So myself and Caleb are actually going to be doing a free web class in, I think about a week and a half. It's Monday, May 24th. It's on a Monday evening. And this is actually for people that want to explore the idea of what does it look like to harvest meat in an ethical and sustainable way from the land. So people that are interested in hunting, but maybe you don't have mentors bringing you into it. Maybe you're not sure about the ethics of it or how to do it sustainably. Maybe you're just not sure how to get started. Maybe you're an early on hunter that doesn't have a mentor and you don't really know what you're doing with it. So we're going to be doing this session we're calling the Hunter's Journey. And it's going to be an introduction to why we hunt and the idea that this is a journey of relationship with the land, just like Laura talked about relationships with plants. We'll be chatting about relationships with ecology and animals through the art of harvesting our own food. And I'm a big believer that, if done in a relational way, it can be incredibly healthy, can be incredibly sustainable, and not hurt wildlife populations, and can grow your connection. So if that interests you and you want to come along on this journey with Caleb and myself, you can actually go to the site. I'm going to put it in here, but it's www.freehuntersjourney.com. I'm going to put it in the site here. freehuntersjourney.com. And we're going to be doing a free class. I'll send out the link afterwards as well. Laura and I also have a class coming up on our land that some of you might be interested in. We're calling the Wild Homestead. And maybe you can share about that one, Lo, a little bit about the Wild Homestead class coming up. If any of you live in Ontario and are interested in coming up into Muskoka region.
Yeah, so through my business, Wild Muskoka Botanicals, I'm doing a few classes this summer. The only class that has room left is actually our homesteading class. So Chris and I were really excited so whenever I've led plant walks or I teach herbal medicine classes, we always end up in the garden. And so people always have all these questions. And so we decided to run a class on how we actually have put together our homestead and the kind of permaculture principles and practices of how it functions. So July 17th and 18th, it's going to be both days. On site on the land. And then we're actually going to do a few days before. It's just an evening Zoom call like we're having right now, but just so that we can cover some of the nuts and bolts and theory, from the comfort of our own homes, people can take notes. And then so that when people actually show up Saturday morning, we can actually get right into the garden and get right to work. And we're going to make it a really hands-on class. We're going to build a hugelkultur bed, and I'm a big nerd about my compost. So I'm like, we're going to build a compost pile, and I'm going to teach everyone about compost, and we'll walk through the gardens and really talk in depth about those kind of principles. Like I was talking about, like, how do you build up the good annual weeds, and what can you use, and how do the animals fit into our system? So it's a class we're really excited to teach this summer.
Yeah, and if you're interested in that and you want to actually come up and learn alongside us and from us actually out on the land, you can go to Laura's website, wildmuskoka.com, and she's got a section there for kind of courses and programs. So in there, you'll see the class, the Wild Homestead class that we're running. As I said, we'll be teaching these kind of different approaches, things like forest gardening and permaculture and tending the wild to grow your own food. I put the link in there again for the freehuntersjourney.com. Last, maybe just share, folks. So you've got a coupon code for folks that are on the call tonight if people are interested in any of Laura's beautiful wild crafted treats. So Laura has a line. She makes digestive and cocktail bitters. So either for digestive health on their own or for putting inside of fun drinks, alcoholic or non-alcoholic. She does infused spices, infused vinegars. So if you've never heard of wild leek or you've never tasted wild leek and you want to try a wild leek vinegar or a wild leek salt, she does some fun stuff like that. So where can people, what's the coupon code and where can people try some of your products?
You can find my stuff on my website, wildmuskoka.com. Chris already has the link there. And Nature Calls gives you 10% off at the checkout.
So I'm just putting that in there. Coupon code Nature Calls for 10% off at the Wild Muskoka store there. So other than that, folks, thanks so much for another great evening. We're going to be back in 2 weeks with the last call in this season. And then I think we're going to take a break for the summer, and I'll probably start it up again in the fall. Although some of you may want to join me on the 24th when I have Caleb Musgrave on and we explore the hunter's journey. So you can check that out too if you want to come join with us. And other than that, happy tracking, and yeah, stay safe. And we'll see you all in
Thanks
a couple of
everyone for
weeks
coming.
when we have Carolyn Crawley on next, as our next presenter. So good night, everybody.